Have you ever been angry with God? The loved one that was taken far too early. The other who lingered and suffered far too long. The disease that came out of nowhere, the healing that never arrived. The marriage that fell apart. The child not saved. The suffering not eased. Prayers not answered. Promises seemingly not kept. Times when God's ways in your life seem rotten, wrong, uncaring, uninvolved, just plain lousy. Have you ever been angry with God? Well, if you've ever felt this feeling, ever thought this thought for even just a moment, know that you are in very good company, for such marks the close of the great story of Moses. This morning we conclude our study of the life of Moses, and as the story ends, we find that it closes, to quote the old saying, not so much with a bang, but with a whimper. Quite literally a whimper. Having spent the last 40 years wandering in the wilderness as the first generation of Israelites dies off, Moses and the second generation finally arrive at the promised land once again. Here the people renew their covenant with God and prepare to enter the land. However, there's one last little detail that needs attending to, namely Moses. What is to become of him? Answer: God is not going to allow Moses to enter the promised land. This is the closing punchline to the whole story. Moses is to die at the very border of Canaan, never to set foot in it. So close and yet so far. Now, earlier on, we're told that Moses has requested that he be allowed to enter the land. In fact, we're told that he has even begged to do so. But God has made it clear that this is not going to happen. And thus the story ends on something of a sour note. With deep poignancy, Moses is left to only look out over the land he has worked so hard to get to. The message of victory and triumph of this great servant of God is tempered instead in the closing chapter with this nagging aftertaste of disappointment and deep frustration. It seems a most unkind move on God's part, almost mean-spirited. Yet no, here it is. This final unpleasant chapter, not deleted, not glossed over, and I believe it's here because it's crucial in that it means to demonstrate to us the very real human struggle it finally is to really live all of this. That is, yes, we have all the pretty words and the promises, but actually living faith in God does not come easily. As last week we heard Moses imploring everyone to love God, so now we discover he was saying this at the very moment he himself was struggling most to do so. Very real difficulty of actually living one's faith amidst all the far too tangible and frequently quite lousy realities of life. What are we to make of this? Well, I'd like to offer a few thoughts on this, on living our faith amidst the most difficult moments of life, most particularly those moments when God seems lousy, right? When we are angry with God. A couple of thoughts. Thought number one: do not go quietly. Right off the top, I believe it's important for us to note that here's the great Moses struggling with issues we also often struggle with, and that, to begin with, that should be reassuring to us that such thoughts are normal and natural, even for the greatest people of faith. There's nothing wrong with us when we have the same kind of crisis of faith, crisis of belief. The issue, of course, being what we do with this leading to our first thought here. As I was considering this closing scene in Moses' life and how he seems to get a rather raw deal from the Lord, one of the things that caught my attention is just how Moses doesn't take this lying down, right? That is, Moses is not at all passive in what happens to him. He has an opinion. He has major problems with what's going on. He is angry, and he lets God know it. A good portion of the book of Deuteronomy being spent in Moses' final griping. He goes at it with God. This, of course, having been a pattern between these two throughout their relationship. Whenever Moses has had a problem with God, he has not stepped back. Rather, he has stepped up, right? He has repeatedly gone head-to-head with God, not in arrogance, imagining himself equal to God somehow, but merely in giving his all. And the most amazing thing about this being that God has not been bothered by this, but quite the opposite, always seemed to welcome it, to enjoy it, to almost invite it, and finally to respect Moses most for it. As it says in the very final paragraph in the story, Never since has there arisen a prophet in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. You see, Moses, he consistently stepped up face to face with God, and God liked that, right? And this has two sides to it. First, it's a reminder that we need to share everything we think and really feel fully with the Lord. Often I think it seems we believe there are certain thoughts and feelings we say, oh, I shouldn't have that, especially about God, They're wrong, they're bad, so we try to hide them. We feel we must push them, deep down inside ourselves. But it's totally wrong. As my father said to me, and the only piece of advice he ever gave me about praying, yet the one that has served me the best, he said simply, in praying, be yourself. If you're angry with God, be angry with God. If you hate God, hate God. Be yourself, because that's what God most wants. He wants you, right? And only there can he reach the real you. Right? God knows that as in any relationship, is only in open and honest sharing that things can be worked through and life found, as with Moses here. This text is first a reminder for us to bring our all to God in prayer, the good, the bad, and the ugly, right? For only there can life be found. And then from this, it's also a reminder to us to demand our all. This is the other side of not going quietly. That is, throughout Moses' life, it's not just that he complained, right? Anybody can complain. Just hang around any church for a while, you'll find that out, right? No, the point is that Moses, he wrestled. He wrestled with God. That is, he gave, but he also took, As in here in the final chapters leading up to his death, he's tossing out different ideas. He's exploring different possibilities, trying to understand. He's trying to grow. He's using all of his strength, and that's the point. He lets the issues that confront him push him, ask a lot of him, totally involve him. And this is another thing that it seems God hopes for all of us. It's a total involvement, our faith, our understanding, our abilities pushed to the maximum, That we rise to our full humanity as God created us. What so often happens when God seems to deal us a bad hand is one of two approaches. Either we just give up on and then turn from God, well, if this is the way God is, then I'll have nothing to do with God. Or conversely, in some misguided understanding of righteousness, we just blandly accept everything, spitting out endless pious platitudes. Well, if it is God's will, then it is fine with me. It is not ours to question, Yet note, either way, it's completely passive. Right? We don't really dig into the issue. We just avoid it. We step around it. We don't get in there and get really messy with the Lord. We won't allow things to push us, and thus we miss the whole thing. To put it another way, how often is the real problem in our lives, the real reason why we're so angry with God, simply that we expected life to just be handed to us, right? We didn't want a lot asked of us. We didn't want to really be pushed. We didn't want to really get involved. We just wanted it all placed in our laps. We've just been phoning it in. But now something great is being asked of us, a real challenge, some real demand, but we won't have it. Right? We yell at God for not helping our marriage, but we never really work at our marriage ourselves. Right? We shake an angry fist at God for not giving us healing, but we don't want to have to explore the depths of what real strength is within us. We curse God for letting a loved one die, but we don't want to find out what real faith in eternity is. More plainly put, we don't want to know and to have to really live the true greatness that is created within us, the greatness God put there and sees in us. And so we take that out on God, right? We're seeking to have a God who enables us to avoid life, but we are confronted instead with a God who calls us to fully engage life, that we might discover its greatest riches and our greatest selves. Are we avoiding or engaging life? And what is that doing to us? Preacher John Ortberg writes, imagine that you have a child, and for 5 minutes you're given a script of what will be that child's life. You have an eraser. You can edit it. You can take out whatever parts you don't want. You read that your child will have a learning disability in grade school. Reading, which comes easily for some kids, will be laborious for yours. In high school, your kid will make a great circle of friends, and then one of them will die of cancer. After high school, your child will actually get into college that they wanted to attend. While there will be a car crash, and your child will lose a leg and go through a difficult depression. A few years later, your child will get a great job and then lose that job in an economic downturn. Your child will get married, but then go through the grief of divorce. You get this script for your child's life and you have 5 minutes to edit it. What would you erase? Wouldn't you want to take out all the stuff that would cause them pain? Ortberg continues, I am part of a generation of adults called helicopter parents because we're constantly trying to swoop into our kids' lives to make sure no one is mistreating them or ever disappointing them. We want them to experience one unobstructed success after another. It's like one Halloween, a mom came to our door to trick or treat. Why didn't she send in her kid? Well, the weather is a little bad, she said, and she was driving so that he didn't have to walk in the rain. But why did she not send him to the door? Well, he had fallen asleep in the car, and so she said she didn't want to have to wake him up. I felt like saying to her, well, then why don't you eat all his candy too and get his stomach ache for him, you know? And then he can be completely protected. If you could wave a wand, if you could erase every failure, setback, suffering, and pain, are you sure it would be a good idea? Would it cause your child to grow up to be a better, stronger, and more generous person? Is it possible, just possible, that in some way people actually need adversity, setbacks, maybe even something like real trauma to reach the fullest level of their development and growth? First thought to consider when life seems lousy and you're most angry with God, do not go quietly. Give all to God and demand all of yourself. From this then, thought number 2, remember that this is not your home. You know, in the New Testament book of Hebrews, the author, he gives the following interpretation of the death of Moses and others like him, the great people of faith who died having never received the promise that they spent their whole life working toward. He writes, all of these died in faith without having received the promises, but from a distance they saw and greeted them. They confessed that they were strangers and foreigners on the earth, for people who speak in this way make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of the land that they had left behind, they would have had an opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God. Indeed, he has prepared a city for them. This, I believe, is the second crucial message we are meant to take from Moses' death, that even though Moses never enters the promised land, that doesn't necessarily make it a wrong ending, right? That in effect, it's exactly the whole point. That he died precisely as he lived, and that his is a model of the life of faith for anyone in this world, namely, that in this life, we can only journey. We're sojourners, we're travelers, we're pilgrims, never really reaching home. We live here, but this is not our home. There's more. There's a real home beyond. There is and can be no ending, no settling here. Yet this is the mistake we all make and the cause of so much pain and frustration and failure for us. We don't journey toward our true home. We settle here and seek to make this the end. We view this as everything. We live too much solely for this life, for this moment, for this time only. We want everything wrapped up here in a neat little bow. We see things, we decide, we judge, we act only for the here and now, for this world. But there's so much more than this. This is not our home. This is not our final resting place, and we get ourselves in major trouble whenever we think that it is. We search for happy endings, but even the best of circumstances, they can never entirely be found because this is not the end. This is not our final home. We long for closure to our places of pain, but it never seems to entirely come because this is not the end. This is not our home. We consume our lives in a frenzied search to find something in this life that will fill and perfectly satisfy us, but it always falls short because this is not the end. This is not our home. You know, there are parts of the text of the Moses story that seem to indicate that the reason for God's refusal to permit Moses to enter the promised land is some failure on Moses' part, the mistakes he made for which he's being punished. However, there are also then long parts of the text that seem to question exactly this point of view, even implying that even if it's true, it's totally unfair, right? And that's the point. That this life is not totally fair. Why? Because this life is not the end of the story. What's the old saying? Expecting life to be fair is like expecting a lion not to eat you because you are a vegetarian. Right? This life is never totally fair because this life is not the end of the story. We're not done yet. Basically, the second point here is that in times of frustration and struggle, you need to take an eternal perspective. Realize that this is not your home. It doesn't end neatly here. It's not fair. And look for the home to come where it all gets wrapped up. Realize the story that seems to have ended tragically is not over. The pain you know now will be swept away. The injury that now plagues you will be no more. Those loved ones you've lost, you will see again. Live for that. Live beyond this life. Live for the issues and matters that are eternal. You know, there's an old fable that's told about a sailor who was shipwrecked in one of the South Sea islands. And he was seized by the natives, and he was hoisted on their shoulders, and he was carried to their village, and he was set upon like a crude throne. And little by little, he learned that it was their custom each and every year to make some man a king. He liked this idea until he began to wonder what happened to all the former kings. Soon he discovered that every year when his kingship was ended, the king was banished to an island where he starved to death. The sailor didn't like that. Right? But he was smart, and he was king. He was king for a year. So as king, he put his carpenters to work making boats, his farmers to work transplanting fruit trees to the island, growing crops, and masons building beautiful houses. So when his kingship was over, he was banished not to a barren land, but to an island rich in abundance where he lived happily ever after. The lesson? That likewise, we are all kings here, kings for a little while at least, able to choose what we will do with the stuff of this life, knowing that this is not the end of the story. The wise person being the one who puts their effort into where they're going and not where they are. Thought number 2, when life seems lousy and you're angry with God, think eternity. Remember that this is not your home. And then finally, thought number 3, look at things from God's perspective. You know, in the end, of course, we've been focusing on our annoyance with God here at the close of the Moses story. But what if we were to turn things around for a moment and consider the situation from God's perspective? Do you think God liked the ending any more than Moses did? Do you think God enjoyed sticking it to his most faithful servant and friend? You know, in the ancient Jewish writings, there's a tradition that states that when Moses was told that he'd not be allowed to enter the promised land, he begged God that if he couldn't enter it as a human, that he might be allowed to fly over it as a bird, or that he might be just permitted to graze on it as a cow. And the legend says that as God told him no, that this would not be possible, that Moses looked over and he saw tears pouring from God's eyes. It broke God's heart just as much as it broke Moses' heart. Have you ever thought of what this moment did to God? We are generally so focused on ourselves that we can't see anything. But if we try to also see things from God's perspective, we gain a bigger picture, namely, that God is here with Moses through all of this. In the end, God doesn't just send Moses a text message, sorry, no promised land, LOL, right, you know? No, God is there to give the difficult news. God is there hurting as well. At some point in Moses' life, it has to end. It's going to have to end, and that's going to hurt. God is there in the good times and in the bad. In the end, God doesn't offer Moses Canaan, but what God offers is God's self. It's the one constant of the whole story, of our whole story. It's God's presence. The question is it enough? How often in the end is this not what we are seeking, and thus why we only know pain and frustration? That in the end, when it comes to our faith in God, we're seeking only stuff from God, getting the things we want, not God's own self, and thus we suffer. The wise person being the one who instead seeks only God always. Final point, when God seems lousy. Don't get lost in your demands and your desires. Just seek God, God's presence, share the experience, and everything will be yours. Author Randy Hoyt writes, "Doctors and nurses were doing everything possible for my wife, the mother of my 7 children, yet I could see the hopelessness in their faces. Through an emergency C-section during the 5th month of her pregnancy, it was discovered the detached placenta had grown through the uterus and attached itself to her bladder. Bleeding was so profuse during surgery that Chris was given 30 units of blood. As the night wore on, her battle for life became desperate. I cried out, "God, what do you want? I know you can heal her. Why don't you?" In the middle of my darkest night, God began to speak. I wanted a miracle. He wanted to discuss his nature. "Do you believe I am a loving God?" the Spirit asked. Sitting beside my wife's bed amidst the chaos of ICU, I needed to answer that question. I could have said, "No, you cannot be a loving God. Look around here. My wife is dying. My newborn daughter may die. I have to go home and tell 6 children that their mother will not come home ever again." But that night, God gave me the grace to see him as he is. "Yes," I told him, "you are a loving God. No matter what happens here tonight, I know that that is your nature." Chris's condition worsened. Chris was determined to give our child all she had to help her in her struggle to live. In the end, it cost Chris her life, and newborn Grace lived just 16 days. "What about our plans, God?" I asked. Who will teach our kids and guide them and love them like their mother?" God laid it on the heart of a man to head up an effort which became known as Help Bring Hope to the Hoyt Kids. In 6 months, hundreds of people worked, sent money, donated supplies, and poured love into our family. Churches provided food daily on weekends. So many people were fed. I received more than 500 letters, emails, and cards from people who said that they were praying for us constantly. I am writing this in the house that God has given us. The medical bills are gone. The house is paid for. I am working as well at schooling my children. One night I lay awake, tormented with the memory of Chris fighting for her life. I tried to remember her with the light of life in her eyes, but all I could see was death. I could feel myself falling into depression when suddenly before me was a vision of Chris, so perfectly alive in Christ, shining and healthy. No pain, just pure joy on her face. "See her as she is now," the Holy Spirit seemed to say. "She's alive. Someday we will be together with Jesus and our daughter Grace." I asked God for the life of my wife. I received instead a lesson on the nature of God. Armed with that knowledge, I have no fear for today or for the future. God will always be enough for any situation. It has been said that faith in God is like the love of family. It's easy when everything's going smoothly, but you only really find out it's there when everything goes wrong. Have you ever been angry with God? When life goes wrong and God seems lousy, don't let the struggle break you, but rather have it remake you. Do not go quietly. Remember that this is not your home, and look at things from God's perspective. Let us join together in singing our closing hymn. In the faith, we sing hymnal number 2032, "My Life is in You, Lord." Would you please stand?